Greetings, FrankDude72 here. Today I'm going to do a book review because even though this is mostly like a gun and self-defense channels, it's important to hone your minds with books. But I would recommend good books to do that. Not today's book, which is Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140. I'm going to do my best to give this book a fair review and note its good points. But the TLDR, or TLDW, for didn't watch, is this is propaganda. This is an advocacy piece. And most people who look at it and see the blurbs about it will think it's about man-made climate change. It touches on that, but it's mostly an advocacy piece for communism and Marxism. And he puts on this veneer of being erudite and being well-read, which he is. Kim Stanley Robinson's a very smart man in a lot of ways, but that's no excuse for just putting together a really poorly constructed, poorly shrouded propaganda piece. So, in fact, I'll just put it to you this way. I have been a Kim Stanley Robinson fan since the 90s. I've read the Mars trilogy, Antarctica, Shaman, 2312, Aurora, and this book parallels my experience with Tom Clancy in that through middle school through college I was a big Tom Clancy fan and I read a ton of Tom Clancy books. And as I got to college, his quality started to taper off, and then I read Rainbow Six. And Rainbow Six is just an atrociously, horribly written book. It's absolute garbage. I'm pretty sure he was just tacking it on as an addendum to the video game he was putting out. New York 2140 is the Rainbow Six of Kim Stanley Robinson's novels. And it has basically put me off him forever. Where before, what I really valued from Kim Stanley Robinson is he knows so much and he's so well educated that you can go through and constantly learn new things and learn new perspectives. And he's obviously well read, he's obviously very intelligent, and by reading someone who's smarter than myself and more educated than myself on certain topics, I can grow as a person. And there is actually a bunch of that in this book. If you were reading this on Kindle, as I advised to my fiance, and you just mark the different authors and artists and historical figures he lists in here and start looking them up, not to mention his vocabulary is pretty immense, so you can use that too. Yeah, you're gonna gain a ton of that insight. But there is just so much fundamental naivete, and the fact that one of the things I learned about Kim Stanley Robinson through reading this, because of a professor he quotes, is that professor he quoted was what's known as a postmodern Marxist. And in his Wikipedia article, as far as people vastly influenced by that professor, Kim Stanley Robinson is one of the main ones. And it shows. His love for Marxism and communism and state control is just, there's no veil. There's no maybes about it through this book. So let me try to give a synopsis that's mostly fair. Okay, it's the year 2140 in the world KSR has painted. There has been enough heating of the atmosphere that it has caused the Antarctic ice shelf to shear off a couple times, raising sea levels roughly about 50 feet, and created coastal cities like New York and others to become super Venices. He originally, as far as I know, put the New York as a super Venice thing out in his book 2312. That's where I read about it first, and since I had already read his portrayal of New York there, plus when I saw it on Amazon, I was like, oh, this is going to be very preachy about man-made climate change, and I know where he stands on that. There's no question, and you hear about that stuff enough. I didn't really need to hear it from him. I felt so I wasn't going to even read the book, but it came up for the book club that I'm in, and so I felt obligated enough to read it that I tackled it, and I'm glad I did, in the sense that I get to at least warn other people about this book. So we've got New York as a super Venice, and the story itself is told through a number of characters, about 6 or 7, who all live at the Metropolitan Life building at this time. You've got a cop, an NYPD cop, you've got a social worker, you've got these 2 guys, Mutt and Jeff, who were originally quantitative analysis people. You've got a guy who works in finance. You've got 2 kids who, plus this old man named Mr. Hexter, who go off and they go on a few kid-like adventures, including finding this sunken ship and their chests of gold. Got a superintendent for the MetLife building, and that goes through all of their perspectives. Plus, you've got sections that are the citizen, which is basically Kim Stanley Robinson dumping a bunch of info, which honestly, for a human-focused book, when you also want to encompass the world at large and a lot of the history, I don't have a problem with the info dumping through that, at least not the method. Whether or not I agree with what that citizen says, I still don't have a problem with the method of painting the broader picture through this extra character. You could kind of consider him like the narrator in the play Our Town. So that's all well and good, and he first details the story of their lives and what they're going through, and just different perspectives on what it's like to live in a flooded New York in 2140. And to sum up the plot, and I'm not going to have a problem giving spoilers through this thing, because the plot isn't all that great. It's a more tightly constructed plot than some of his books, like 2312 is more or less just a tour through the solar system at that time, with a tiny little Scooby-Doo plot plucked in the middle. This one has a little more plot than that, but it's basically what comes to head is the MetLife building has an offer on it from some shady organization, and they're also using submarine drones to drill into the building and sabotage it to incentivize the people underhandedly to sell the building. The MetLife building and all the characters in it, it's as a cooperative where everybody gets to buy their little closet-sized apartment, and they do chores for the building, and they eat in a dining hall, and the social worker Charlotte, it is just incensed by this, and the mystery is finding out who that is, and through that, because of the massive amounts of man-made climate change, a super cyclone rips through New York about 2/3 in, tears the place up, and a lot of people are left homeless. And the argument is, well, uptown that's not flooded, people who've worked hard and built lots of money have apartments that they didn't use, and that was the tipping point, because they didn't just house these refugees in there as if no other there was no other possible solution than to house people in that. And I honestly don't feel like he really, the amount of furor that people felt to bring it to that tipping point was really justified. But through all that and the mystery of who's trying to sell it, we discover that it's this financier's Franklin, one of his bosses or mentors, causing it. And meanwhile, Charlotte, the social worker, is working with her ex-husband, who's chairman of the Federal Reserve, to nationalize the banks and completely take over the entire financial sector and put it in the hands of the government, because you can't trust the market to run anything anymore. And by the end, that's the happy ending that happens. So again, I did want to say there is a lot of good stuff in here as far as how he paints the world. And Kim Stanley Robinson is largely viewed as the Michener or the James Clavell of science fiction, and he usually does a pretty good job world building large, expansive settings and all the different bits and pieces in here. And again, he's also very erudite, and there's a lot of references to a lot of really obscure things. And if you like fact finding and going down bunny trails, there's tons of that there. Which is why I'm actually really surprised at how easy it is to deconstruct this whole thing. So for starters, on the characters, the characters, though he's given what should be a broad swath of characters, certainly one character that he doesn't really have as a representation in here is a small business person, and all the trouble that a small business person would go through in this environment, and what all those problems those regulations would cause. Because if you talk to a small business person, especially one in New York State today, talk to someone who either works there, or especially maybe somebody whose business is based outside of New York and has to hire New York people, and the amount of legal BS that they have to go through, the onerous regulations, and just the ludicrousness, that alone in that section, that's bad enough. Putting in what he thinks are the ways to fix finance would make it a ton harder. The closest he gets to having small business, you could say, oh yes, one of the characters I didn't do is talk about is Amelia. She rides in a blimp everywhere, but docks at the MetLife building, and relocates wildlife. You could consider her a small business person maybe, but she's mostly the talent for a entertainment enterprise. And so the closest to a small business person you're going to get detailed here is the Adelba character, who is the superintendent Vlad's ex-wife, and she really doesn't seem to have any problems. It doesn't even mention the regulations causing her problems. So big overlook there. And if you were going to have a complete swath of characters representing everything, miss the boat there. So on to the world building, because that's a big thing that Kim Stanley Robinson is adept at normally. It really seems like these characters are characters from today, 2019, or this was published in 2017, so it was written probably about 2016. But in that they were transplanted from now and put into 2140 and that situation. And that is a risk a lot of sci-fi writers have to deal with. But KSR is usually a little better at that. In fact, quite a bit better than that. But where that comes from is their perspectives. But not only that, as far as the world building, the pop culture for these characters, what they refer to, whether it's genuine pop culture or whether it's historical figures or artists or writers or whatever, their entire culture with way less than 1% of references is early 21st century or 20th century references. Maybe some before 20th century, but nothing seems to have happened pop culture wise except for the rising of the sea levels after 2017 in these characters' worlds. They really seem as if they're fixated, as if they're Rip Van Winkles or Buck Rogers. And everything they refer to centers on this contemporary time, which, yes, I'm sure to make it relatable to audiences, you could argue for that, but it's to the point where it's heavily distracting. And what it really reminds me of a lot is Ready Player One. And Ready Player One is an atrociously bad book. If you remember Jurassic Park and that gigantic pile of Triceratops dung, that's what Ready Player One is to literature. 2140 is better written than that and better structured and doesn't have Marty Stews in it, but it's bad. So, but what I mean by that is there are so many references to obscure historical figures, writers, artists, etc. And not by just one character. Like, he's got the Mr. Hexter character, who is this old man who remembers a whole bunch of stuff. And if it was just him and maybe two other people who were very familiar with obscure literature and history, and then they mentioned this, and the other character was like, "Oh, what are you talking about? Oh, and let me explain why this is relevant." That could work. But when way more than half of the major characters all refer to really obscure, even for a half-decently educated person like me, I have to look it all up constantly to see what the heck they're talking about, and the other character's like, "Oh yeah, you're totally right, just like that." That's desperation. And really what I think he's trying to do is try to wrap this whole book in this veneer of respectability by saying, look how much stuff I know, look how much obscure historical figures and writers and artists I know about, so you should respect what else I have to say. And it just doesn't work. And in fact, with Ready Player One, with all its 80s pop culture, Gen Xer pop culture references, there was at least a reason why everybody knew that this Oasis game where they're looking for the prize meant you had to learn all that stuff. These characters don't have to know about all these obscure historical figures, etc., but they seem to anyway. So, world building fail, serious suspension of disbelief fail on Kim Stanley Robinson's part, and that was really disappointing. Just real quick on the world building fail, this is set about 120 years but after now, 2019. Think about 120 years before now, which was 1899. What did the world look like? Germany and Italy were barely unified, not for even 100 years. The Spanish-American War had just wrapped up, and Spain was just becoming not an imperial power. The Austro-Hungarian Empire still existed. The Ottoman Empire still existed. Russia was under a czar. We hadn't had widespread communism and fascism inflict horrible massacres on people. Slavery hadn't even been banned in the US and Brazil for 50 years and had been made illegal in England for only 59 years. there was no heavier than air flight, no mass-produced cars. People were still getting around on horseback. I can go on, but again, the world was massively different 120 years ago, and I imagine the world will be a lot more massively different than the world KSR paints in 2140. Especially if you just look at the actual pace of technological change. He really, really misses the boat as far as scope of vision. Let's go into the climate change part. First off, whatever I say, if it's counter to what you believe, I don't feel I'm going to change your mind. There's an excellent article about why facts don't change different people's beliefs, and it essentially centers on that you'd have to leave a camp or tribe or whatever you want to call it, a group of people you feel like you agree with and identify with, and changing your opinion means leaving that and leaving who you are. So if you disagree with me, that's fine. Like I said, the Earth has warmed up enough that the Antarctic ice shelf, several big chunks have broken off, and sea levels have risen by 50 feet. And I will give this to him. At least he did this. At least he hasn't. His timeline for that happening wasn't immensely quick. So many doomsayers that completely shred the whole man-made climate change argument of credibility say this will happen in 10 years, this will happen in 12 years. It's been happening since at least the 70s and not the 80s, where people have said by 2000 or 2011 or whatever. And yes, we're talking about major voices within that movement, such as Al Gore, have given us deadlines of when whole coastal cities will be underwater, and it keeps not happening. And when that doesn't happen, that shreds your credibility. When institutions like East Anglia University and the United Nations and NOAA all get caught fudging their numbers, that kills a lot of the credibility of this argument. Kim Stanley Robinson at least doesn't do that, where he goes into some of the science, talks about the warming of the oceans way down low, and the fact that it takes several decades and multiple stages of those decades to cause the change in climate that floods these cities. And also the fact that he doesn't say it's completely devastating and humanity's is no longer sustainable on Earth. It doesn't kill humanity completely either. So credit to him on that compared to most people who seem to be in this camp. In fact, yeah, just a quick aside as far as what I see from a lot of people in that camp. My fiance had me watch this silly little Dicky CGI'd auto-tune pop song full of celebrities talking about how we love the Earth, and isn't that cute, and it's really catchy, and it's stuck in my head forever. But the last quarter of the video was shilling for this Leonardo DiCaprio guy's really figured it all out, and you should listen to it. Like so many very prominent advocates in that climate change thing, this is a guy living in complete opulence and totally disconnected from the populace, who is telling everybody else to live in an austere lifestyle and to give all your money in taxes to the government because they've got some magical way of reversing it, and really appealing to people's vanity as far as that they really think they can make a change if they just give a bunch of taxes over. Never mind, he hasn't given up his yachts and private jets and giant mansions. That if you believe in the whole carbon footprint thing, people like him have a huge carbon footprint if you believe in that. If you want a celebrity, if you believe in the man-made climate change thing and you want a celebrity to applaud, then try someone like Daryl Hannah, who actually inflicts all that austerity she thinks other people should do on herself. So anyway, aside from all that, we could make a big bunch of arguments about how a lot of those models are fudged or big doomsday models, or that a lot of the more respectable models have a much lower rise in sea level, if at all, or the fact that satellite footage reveals that extra CO2 in the atmosphere is actually greening the Earth and causing more forests, or the fact that there is an argument that we're technically still in an ice age and that polar caps on the Earth are unusual in our vast geological history, and so this is actually a very natural correction to how the Earth is, or that humanity's CO2 output, as far as the parts per million we're contributing, is roughly about 6% of all that, compared to every volcanic eruption. It outdoes all the carbon emissions we have, or that even if we went to this complete Amish level austerity, that we might affect the temperature of the atmosphere on average by 1%, 1 degree over the next 100 plus years. Leaving all of that aside, let's just talk about why it's flawed within Kim Stanley Robinson's own universe. Basically, in 2140 and 2312, he argues there's really nothing that can be done to reverse this climate cycle change. However, in his Mars trilogy, he's got Mars within a couple hundred years, which is just a ridiculously optimistic time frame, completely terraformed to an Earth-like world that is breathable for normal people to walk around and filled with oceans. And then to cap that off, in 2312, he's got Venus as basically breathable shirt sleeves world in just a couple hundred years. You can't have it both ways. You can't have the Earth, which is already suited to human habitation, be impossible to reverse the climate on and to manage the climate on, and then Mars, and especially Venus with 93 times our atmospheric density, suddenly just an easily shirt sleeves world. No. You can't do it both ways. It can't be super easy on planets that don't resemble Earth at all, and super hard on Earth itself. It doesn't work. If you watch a wonderful video by Isaac Arthur, he actually proposes a genuine solution where, instead of just living more austere lifestyles and dumping a bunch more of our income into the government hands, which are so well known for managing it well, he talks about running mirrors and reflectors to, if you really want to curb the amount of energy that is hitting the Earth and you want to control the temperature, if we build giant mirrors, that is actually a plausible way we could do that, which nobody on the man-made climate change panic advocacy front is even proposing. And Kim Stanley Robinson's aware of such a solution, because in 2312 he actually proposes that for one of the big ways that Venus is able to be terraformable to the point of being shirt sleeves friendly. So again, can't have it both ways. You just nope. All right, the last and most ranty part. This is going to be all the really insanely stupid things that are in 2140. Most of it's the financial arguments, but there's a little bit else as well, but it's all the really stupid stuff. What I want to start with was early on, the Mutt and Jeff characters, which are done in kind of this conversational thing where it's comparable to Waiting for Godot or Kiss of the Spider Woman or Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. They're constantly going back and forth, and except they're saying stupid anti-capitalist stuff. And one of the worst things this dude says, the same dude who thinks he has 16 fixes, which is really Kim Stanley Robinson saying, I have 16 fixes, that if I put them in place, then everything will be perfect, which really is a complete false assumption, because it doesn't it assumes everything is static and doesn't take into account all the workarounds people are going to try to do to get around these stupid restrictions. But even much more moronic, what is said is we should cap everyone's wealth at $5 million. I admit, if you're somebody who doesn't think they'll ever be wealthy, and $5 million is so much more than you think you'll ever have in your hands, that may sound like it's fair or something. But that is foolish to say in 2016, 2017, 2019 US dollars. With the amount of inflation you'd get by 2140, that is just ridiculously ludicrous. And let me explain why. The people who get to that wealth level, it's typically because they know how to generate income, and they know how to generate businesses, and with those businesses they know how to generate jobs. So think about all the people who create jobs, because 60% of Americans are employed by what are considered small businesses. That more than 60%. And that is where the jobs come from, is people who have ideas and make stuff happen and hire people and create services and serve the public through their businesses. And if you cap the amount of wealth that they can get, they'll probably find workarounds with their families and other people they know as far as joint ownership, but it's a really onerous restriction and really disincentivizes the kind of people who bring us so many great things. It pulls the rug out from under their motivation, because if I can't build stuff, and even if it's restaurants, if I wanted to open a restaurant and that does really well, I bet a lot of other people in a lot of other locations want restaurants just like that. Well, you can only build so many restaurants because you can't own more than $5 million worth of wealth. That's just a small example, but I could go on and on, but I need to touch on all the other BS that he proposes. Probably one of the most obviously stupid things that's put into this book is the Amelia character relocates 6 polar bears to Antarctica because polar bears in the book are almost going extinct, blah, blah, blah. And as soon as she relocates them and flies them away, a group that wants to keep Antarctica pure nukes them. Whether it's a regular fission or hydrogen bomb, or he suggests it's maybe a neutron bomb. You want to keep the environment pure, so you set off a nuclear device. Never mind the difficulty in obtaining a weapons-grade nuclear device and weapons-grade nuclear material, which now is really difficult, and I can imagine in 2140 is incredibly difficult, not to mention manufacturing the bomb itself. If you do that in an environment, you kill a lot more fauna than just the 6 polar bears, especially since she released them near a ton of Weddell seals to give them food. So you've just wiped out that entire section of wildlife. What? Stupid! And like you really couldn't, if they really wanted that, you couldn't just give them hunting rifles and have them shoot the 6 bears. I know he hates guns. He made that clear in one little sentence in his book. But maybe he figures that the entire world will have banned all small arms. Trust me, if the world can enact a complete, utter shutout of civilians having small arms, they will have the ability to shut out you gaining weapons-grade nuclear material a lot easier than access to small arms. This is just freaking ridiculous. So, I want to touch on some parts of the plan that are just absolutely stupid. There was one section in here when I read it, it honestly made me choke. I've never had a book make me choke when I read a section. And then I texted to my fiance about how it made me choke, and then I reread it and it made me choke again. So, page 434. So that's when you tell her to nationalize the biggest banks and investment firm, bail them out by buying them out. At that point, the American people are in control of global finance. No, they're not. Then the government, which is not the people, if the government is anywhere near that powerful, it's not the people, it's not the populace. In the cosmic battle between people and your oligarchy over there, gesturing Wall Street and the super scrapers uptown, the people will unexpectedly gain the upper hand. No, the government will have gained the upper hand and have a lot more control over the people than any corporation or banks or businesses has. You can print money, devaluing the currency, restore confidence, crank the handle and get things going. Africa, the ridiculous profits from finance will belong to the people. No, they'll belong to the government, which will squander them wastefully. Also, you can aim finance at solving people's real problems by piling on government programs that don't freaking work and just consume a ton of money. Congress can reform the financial system based on laws you write for them to pass. You can quantitatively ease the American taxpayer instead of the banks. Print money, devaluing the currency massively, and give it to the bank of Mr. and Ms. Taxpayer, who will have money resembling Russian rubles or Iraqi dinars or Confederate dollars. I'll give him props that he says 2 pages over. Now it couldn't go much further without her foundering on her own ignorance. Actually, she's been foundering on her own ignorance and your naivete for way longer than that. Oh my God. There's just so... A lot of people won't understand how bad that plan is, but that's just a surefire way to grow the government. And when you grow the government, the more you grow it, the less connected and answerable to the people it becomes. This is a complete way to just obliterate it. And a lot of that conversation and several other conversations about finance hinge upon the 2008 collapse. Apparently he read a book, or probably more than one book, but he mostly talks about a particular book that detailed a whole bunch of stuff that were happening in the 2008 collapse that basically advocated for the government takeover. And but he leaves 2 crucial pieces out. One is there is no mention anywhere in as much detail as he goes in about the 2008 financial collapse. He mentions not a whit about all the restrictions put in at the Clinton administration that forced banks to make house loans and other loans to people who were financially unable to pay it back. Thus, by getting Fannie Mae compliance, you had to make these horrifically dumb loans, and then because all the banks knew they had these really dumb loans, they were trying to desperately find a way to not be saddled with them, and they bundled them and sold them on the market and kept passing them on until somebody finally said, no, there were no buyers left for those stupid loans bundled together. There's no mention of that. It's all pro-government. The other big thing that's pro-government that he really touches on poorly is he talks about Obama nationalizing General Motors and the U.S. automotive industry in 2009, and how great that was and what a smart move it was. It wasn't it wasn't to keep those car companies afloat. They would have declared bankruptcy and restructured and gotten back. They wouldn't have just disappeared off the face of the earth. The whole point of nationalizing them is if they declared bankruptcy, it would have rendered those United Auto Worker Union contracts null and void. Those same contracts where they get 85% of their pay even if they're not working, and they can refuse going back to work. Okay, before I detail the last bits of stupidity, the part that made me choke and a lot of the other reforms proposed are by the Charlotte social worker character. I just wanted to say her and the Amelia character they're supposed to be heroes. They're actually really dangerous people. Dangerous in the sense that where they made their decisions from, especially what put them over the tipping point, were complete emotional outbursts. They already believed dangerous stuff, naive stuff, but they finally went into action because they were super emotional and they weren't thinking about the pitfalls. All right, and an addendum on that. Government debt and government money is not inexhaustible. KSR for some reason thinks you can constantly print more money and it won't be devalued. Hello, so much of sub-Saharan Africa, Iraqi dinars, Brazil, Argentina, lots of Latin America. Yeah, that doesn't really work out that way, because he keeps talking about, besides 2008, a couple more times in history, all of a sudden the government bails out and all this money, and like the United States credit rating will never go down and our value of currency will never go down versus internationally. And to the point where when asked, you know, well, where will we get our investment if you put in all these strictures, this Charlotte woman, the idiot, says, oh, we can just do that with T-bills. All the other financial avenues will be cut off, and we can just use T-bills, which have a horrible rate of return compared to investing in businesses, or even investing in mutual funds, which is like a mini way of investing in businesses. If you look at any chart of that rate of return, and what happens when we treat our debt as inexhaustible, do you think those T-bills, do you think anybody's going to buy those treasury bills? If the United States or whatever government is issuing them has no value because their currency has been flooded and devalued, that's suddenly a sound investment? And here's another problem I had with KSR's thesis, and honestly a bunch on the left or who are advocating socialism or advocating for Marxism or whatever government control thing. They never mention, acknowledge, and certainly don't encourage vehicles for charitable contributions. There is no mention in that. Who do you think makes the biggest donations to charity? Just like who pays the lion's share of taxes, who makes the biggest donations to charities? It's rich individuals and corporations, and then the aggregate, it gets filled in by people of lesser incomes. But there's no even talk within Marxism or socialism or whoever advocating for anything similar of encouraging charitable contributions, of volunteering your resources for that. Because there's this misguided belief that paying taxes to the state is somehow paying to charity. Never mind, it's coerced, rather than creating a culture of contributing to charity. And when you look at people who advocate for that kind of philosophy, that socialist sort of philosophy, one of the things you're going to find is their personal charitable contributions are, on average, much less than those who believe in a free market. One of the big flaws throughout 2140's thesis and a lot of other works, propaganda, art, whatever you want to call it, advocating for that sort of deal is there is no acknowledgement or thought as to what the potential unintended consequences will be, rather than think if we can just institute these regulations and have complete control, then everything will work just fine and everybody will be happy, rather than when you give everybody everything and they don't have to work for it and they don't have to compete for it. Time and time again, historically, what you see is a stunting of ambition. This is the big problem with that argument, is that people are so convinced that only the state can give them the handouts to gain any sort of affluence, that they no longer believe in themselves and their ability to cause change. So anyway, so let's touch on the last bit of really stupid stuff, because at the last Citizen chapter, page 602, details all the stuff he really wants to do, and it really needs to be broken down why this book is so dangerous in that how it lauds so many ideas. He's pushing for what he calls salvation by nationalization, and a big part of why he advocates for it working is if every country around the world, this pro-globalization thing, also advocates for this just complete takeover of everybody's finances and putting onerous restrictions on them. Because part of the counter-argument to putting in a bunch of communist restrictions and strangle-holding everybody's life is what will happen is people who are earners, people who start businesses, and the middle class, anybody who can afford to, will flee that country and go to a more welcoming place. Since it's 2019, probably the best example currently is Venezuela, where you've got 3 million people have fled what used to be the second most prosperous country in the Western Hemisphere. So he talks about all kinds of capital flight laws, capital flight taxes, basically meaning if we put in all these horrendous taxes up to 91% in place, and then we make all these these restrictions on you taking your capital out, that'll keep it in place. And if all the other governments make it so too, then there's nowhere for you to run. We'll have a complete global stranglehold on everybody's wealth. And then where asset tax, sorry, there's just so much, and I don't want to read the entire book to you. But yeah, finance was now for the most part a privately operated public utility. But yeah, capital flight stopped, tight currency controls, and the neoliberal global order was thus overturned right in its own wheelhouse. So, but then he advocates for these new taxes and the nationalization of finance meant the U.S. government would soon be dealing with a healthy budget surplus. Naive to the extreme. What happens when you put all these extra taxes and all this crushing amount of restrictions on people is there is less innovation, less entrepreneurship, less well-paying jobs, less generation of wealth, because in this country, the U.S. and other countries where you get generation of wealth, by far the biggest chunk of money given to the government is by those who generate that kind of wealth, by small business owners and large corporations. Universal health care, free public education through college, a living wage, in other words, universal basic income, guaranteed full employment. What? Okay, all of these things are completely unworkable, and as your capital influx dries up, you run out of money. It's what happened with the Soviet Union as to why it collapses, what's happening with Venezuela. I believe it was Denmark completely ran out of money for their healthcare system. The big trouble with a nationalized healthcare system is, yeah, for little scrapes and scratches and basic health needs, it covers pretty fine. But when you get to big major surgeries and extension of life stuff and anything necessary, just talk to people who are actually there, who've had to deal with getting heart surgery or any major surgery. You have to wait an extraordinary long time, and that's if the state allows you to get that surgery. You could have cancer. It happens tons of times where if you could have cancer and the state will say, well, no, we're not going to pay for your cancer treatment. You're just going to have to die because you're not contributing to the taxes we need to fund our universal healthcare system anyway. That's why actually at MD Anderson Cancer Center and lots of places in the Houston Medical Center, you'll find people from Canada, from Europe, from many other countries where they get completely free healthcare that completely sucks. Yes, this universal living wage and guaranteed for employment. There are some places that have tried the universal basic income thing, and they're already finding they're running out of money. All of these guaranteed things completely disincentivize people to achieve, and completely there's no more motivation to work. Why? My needs are taken care of. I can just sit around the house. There'll always be a few people who want to achieve, but your culture will wilt and atrophy. Yeah. They were only the most prominent of the many good ideas we proposed. Please feel free to add your own favorites. How about you not institute any of your ignorant BS? I'm sure there's some things I haven't touched on. In this book, but I have rambled on and on and on for a long time, and I'm sure there's some arguments and counter arguments I haven't made just going through this, but again, it's just taken so long just to rattle off these basic level thoughts of how appalled by this book I am. And just one final point I want to touch on, and I think this is very, very significant, is that one of the things you've got to remember when you look at Marxism or fascism, communism, socialism, or any overly authoritarian philosophy, and no matter how much it promises that it helps people or makes things fair or going to make people's lives better, the core of its philosophy and people like Marx and Hitler and Stalin is that they actually really hate people because they don't want to give people the freedom to act in their best interests. The whole core of this philosophy is, if you just conform to my brilliant plan and go along and obey your marching orders, your life will be perfect. And once that's instituted, we're not going to give you any choice. You just have to do it, because that's going to be the perfect world where you stick to what I say and you don't get to choose anything else. Look, freedom is messy, and yeah, when individuals have it, they make mistakes, and sometimes that's messy too. But what's a lot more messy is when the state or any institution has so much control that it takes a violent revolution to overturn it, which is exactly what happens with stuff like communism and Marxism, and is exactly what happens to the so wonderful panacea, great utopia that something like 2140 is advocating. That's why this book is dangerous, because it is completely naive of all the evil seeds that it will germinate. And that, since this is genuine freaking propaganda, that is why I am no longer a fan of Kim Stanley Robinson and will no longer buy any of his books.